I should say I'm not an attorney. I happen to be married to one. But a lot of my research was looking at sort of the legal procedure of a capital crime case. And, so there's sort of the obvious parallels of, that you can't help, but all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and you start considering kind of just the notion and the collective body of a jury being 12 souls. And you go back to the apostles of 12 apostles and you start looking at sort of just the relationship of these dozen cast of characters throughout history, not in just these two episodes. And there is something mystical about that jury of 12.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
In the Wake of Golgotha, Part 1 of 2.
Well, welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. I'm David. Wendy is out running her businesses. That's always a double-edged sword for her. She loves doing a podcast, but business calls sometimes. But I've got a special bonus set of episodes that we're going to run today on a gentleman I met through email named Daniel Grace. And so welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Absolute pleasure to be here. This is going to be a fantastic conversation.
I am intrigued, and I don't want to dive in and tip the crowd off too much to what it's going to be about, but I definitely believe it's going to be good, or we wouldn't have sat down together for sure and taken the time to put this together. So give us a 36,000-foot view of who you are, what you do, and where you're going to take our imaginations.
Perfect, because it's a long answer that I'll try and make short. So by trade, I'm a winemaker, and I don't look like it. I don't look like a typical Tuscan wine producer. But I own and operate a family winery in the heart of the Chianti Classico region. It's actually a property that its Etruscan roots date back 2,000 years. The vineyards were first planted by Franciscan monks in the 1500s. We're primarily a Sangiovese producer. So I operate in a valley steeped with history and poetry. And it's an exciting, inspiring place to write, which is a good segue into my other side hustle, if you will, as a writer of books like this.
I love it. I love it. Absolutely. Hold that up again just a little longer. We got to make sure we pitch.
We've got to pitch. Exactly.
Okay. What a name. Okay. Even the name, we have to admit the name just says, tell me more. And it's neat to meet somebody in the wine business. I know that a few years ago, I took Wendy out the week after Christmas to drive some of the PCH out in California.
Exactly right.
And we got to go through, we actually landed in wine country and kind of worked our way back down and whatnot. So beautiful. Do you happen to make a Moscato d'Asti?
Not a Moscato d'Asti, not yet. We have a lovely Vinsanto, we've got a Rosato, a Trebbiano, but primarily we're a Chianti Classico producer that's focused on our Sangiovese.
Gotcha. Do you know if your wine makes it to Kentucky?
It's interesting. We make it close. We make it to Cincinnati. And so we're in about 40 states in the U.S. Kentucky's got some complicated laws when it comes to importing wine. We produce about 250.
Very much so. That's why I asked. It's almost like we're very Puritan or stuck up or something. Right. It's kind of crazy. It's a
complicated French.
I'll have to head up. Cincinnati's not too far. Next time I'm up in Cincinnati, I'll have to make sure I pick some of those up. And I asked about the d'Asti because if Wendy was here, that's hers. I mean, it's got always has to be a sparkling white. And me, I'm really good with the rich reds, the dry reds and things like that. I try to stay close to ketosis, and those are keto friendly.
Exactly. So this is why we get along for sure. And tell Wendy that. My heart also leans towards Franciacorta, so she speaks my language too.
Oh, fantastic! Well, let's dive in. Kind of an interesting career to be in and whatnot. But let's go ahead and identify the book and tell us what that title means, and let's walk in from there.
Sure. So the book, it's my debut literary thriller, if you will, and it's called In the Wake of Golgotha. And just to sort of set the scene. For those of you who don't know, Golgotha is also known as Calvary Hill, and it is up at the top of the Via Dolorosa at the Plateau of Skulls upon Golgotha where Christ was crucified. And so the book, it isn't necessarily about that act, but it's certainly about the aftermath, and it's about so it's not about who rose, it's about who fell and who stayed behind and who remains in the shadow of that cross. And it's a reimagining and a retelling of the story of two of history's most infamously damned characters, that of Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate. And really their wrestle with crime and punishment. And it's a modern day contemporary story of violence, addiction, guilt, sorrow, crime, punishment, and ultimately about a quest of redemption. Which I think is so relevant for today's discussion, because sort of the origins of the story ultimately lie, in, as far as I'm concerned, sort of the ultimate true crime, this moment of capital punishment of crucifixion that occurred 2,000 years ago upon this hill. And the story is really about who cast judgment, who committed the crime, who served the sentence. And it's really a story that unfolds over 2,000 years.
And can I add, we're recording this during Lent.
Well, exactly. It's appropriate. It's perfect timing. So said my publisher.
No, there we go. So there's the kismet part of it, the providence part of it. So let's roll. Dig in, start anywhere you want to with it. I'm intrigued. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I'm always pretty clear with people about when I haven't, but it's in the cart and it's ready to come. And to let you know too, is just in June I published my first book, and the fun part about when you're done publishing, Daniel, is you actually get to read again.
Right, exactly.
Because when you're in the middle of writing, you're not reading anything except your own stuff. And most time, I'm questioning why I even wrote one sentence. So congratulations to you on that. But go ahead and take us through it, and let's roll and talk.
Amazing, and congratulations to you too. It's a slippery, deep, dark rabbit hole when you go down the path of writing a book. So, we've come through relatively unscathed. So, good for us, I say. So in the Wake of Golgotha, and so I was kind of struck by the idea of the death of legend. And as we kind of came out of the last century, what I was struck by was as a modern contemporary culture, we found less of a need, and there were less relevance for these incredible sort of mythological, biblical, literary, even comic book heroes and anti-heroes that for generations upon generations really served as our collective compass, right? In terms of whether it's social good, whether it's sort of this play of immortality versus morality. And as we sort of came into the digital age, I was just struck by the fact that those sort of mystical and mythological, some real, some fictitious, heroes and anti-heroes were replaced by very real, fallible people. So the origins of the story sort of started really with this loss of legend, this death of legend, and this wake around this moment in time. I then became, as part of this cast of characters, somewhat obsessed with this character of Judas Iscariot. And that led me down this path to sort of reconsider really the crime that he had been sentenced for. And I think what's interesting about both Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate, these are two people who have become almost abstract adjectives. They've become violent, villainous verbs throughout the ages. And yet they're rather two-dimensional people. And so what was interesting when I was considering, this moment on a hill, and again, this trial and this crime and this punishment and this capital punishment in the form of crucifixion, which is a word that rarely escapes the human psyche, yet alone the human mouth, and it stings on its way out. And yet this was a standard form of capital punishment 2,000 years ago. It still currently exists as a form of capital punishment in many pockets of our world. I was struck by the fact that historically and culturally, these two characters, Judas and Pilate, for the role that they played in this crucifixion, have been, more than damned by culture. They've been lynched by history. And what I found in starting to do some of the research around, their steps towards this hill of Golgotha, was how little was known about these pivotal players. And there's almost a Mandela effect around what we think we know around Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate. And what was fascinating was having to kind of deconstruct the almost convenient narrative about their backstory, about their intention, about the roles that they played, in terms of whether they were complicit, whether they were responsible. And what was fascinating, historically speaking, both of them, they're almost ghosts in terms of sort of their past and also what happened to them after the cross, right? There's the narrative of Judas's suicide at the bottom of Golgotha. There's the narrative of Pilate's silence for his remaining 6 years in Judea. And yet I was fascinated about the impact of these characters. So that's the setup and kind of the backstory of the book.
Fascinating. And when you're saying that, it resonates as somebody who was raised, just to be honest, a traditional Catholic, and we study scripture and we go to school for that and everything. But you're right. It's like the biblical story that we're told or handed down is kind of like a show with commercial time breaks. There's not a lot of time that's in it, and it's going to go straight to the material points. And my curiosity piqued while you were talking. Yeah. Is that because now I'm starting to think that who they were, what their role was, and you made a good point. It's 2,000 years ago. What were the cultural and societal expectations and norms of people in those positions faced with those things? We both know that when people go back, in my opinion, and they criticize people in history, largely criticize them, a lot of times they don't take into account for the world they were living in.
Sure.
And it's pretty easy to armchair quarterback now and look back and say this and that. And I won't worry about a whole lot too big, but also in a religious context, everybody that was involved in any of that had a significant role, and by design. I'll stop there. I don't want to go and deviate that too much. But where do you start, Daniel? When you get interested, you've got these two people that we know and we've been raised to know about, and you want to learn more about them. How does one take that on? How do you go further?
Well, it's interesting. So in considering these two characters, I also knew that I didn't necessarily want to write a book that was sort of a retelling of a biblical story, and so I knew that I wanted to write a story about kind of their journey through history that brought them into a contemporary setting in New York, and draw parallels of capital punishment 2,000 years ago to what it is today, and draw parallels between ancient Jerusalem and ancient Rome to current day New York City, kind of the dawn of a declining empire, perhaps. And so the story that was crafted ultimately is around sort of inspired by a series of brutal murders that took place in New York, and it's sort of centered around this character who again has sort of a loose references to kind of this shadowy, almost kind of, for lack of a better word, this dark evil presence who crucifies three men in his moldy basement, bloody basement hall in Chinatown, New York, and it's this violent intersection and bringing in modern day addiction that brings in the current incarnations of these two characters. And part of it is because, Golgotha and this moment on a hill 2,000 years ago and the trial of Christ and Caiaphas's role as a high priest in that, and the laws around, who can put someone to death in ancient Jerusalem, and it could only be done by the hand of Rome, hence Pontius Pilate. This is thin ice territory, right? This is oftentimes taboo territory that you don't want to necessarily confront. So the intention was to shake the tree today, right? And not shake the tree 2,000 years ago, and tell a story that has relevance today about all of our collective struggles uphill, right? And the guilt and the sorrow and the sin and the hopelessness and the hope and the quest for redemption that we all carry forward up our own hills. And who are we to cast judgment? Yet reflecting on, we absolutely do cast judgment. And so, how did I start the story? Again, I think it was in this sort of blank canvas of the past, which throughout the book, there are sort of whispers and echoes back to these original characters in that original time. But for the most part, it's really just this, tale of violence bringing these characters together and reconciling sort of their role in a modern society relative to their past lives, incarnations, and again the guilt that they carry forward. So it's as some of the reviews that have been fantastic have said, this is not a light beach read. So, this is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm coming from it from a place of a practicing Catholic, but very aware I didn't want to craft a biblical tale. This is not necessarily a religious story. This is kind of this is a dark leaning literary thriller that's looking at biblical characters through a lens of modern day, as I say, crime and punishment, and sort of our struggle through darkness. And it's been a fascinating journey because I was also struck with sort of the idea. It's also a story of kind of a universal ego and an id. And as a student of Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot and a lot of other things, I was also struck by the relationship of Judas and Pilate and kind of this strength on one hand and weakness on the other, and yet fate bringing them together. And you can't help but wonder in the narrative, this is all of our struggle. And so you then draw those associations, with any characters in Greek mythology, any characters in Roman mythology, every other religion on the planet starts with a painful trip up a hill and an encounter of tremendous violence. And then when you even start thinking about comic book heroes and anti-heroes, at the end of the day, these are very much stories and tales, often dark, often one-way journeys that are really that struggle of ego and id. I found this story, I found it faith affirming to kind of challenge the convenient narrative of the roles of Judas and Iscariot. And I found myself personalizing, if you will, their journey and their questions and their sacrifice and their strength and their weakness relative to, again, this Messiah, right? And again, these are sort of pan-religious conversations and pan-generational conversations that I found, as I say, sort of faith affirming. But at the same time, I also wanted to write a tale, that will resonate with an atheist, with someone who has more of an agnostic view. And I think who just is looking through this from a historical lens and is sort of fascinated by our cultural relationship. Again, I keep harping back on it, of crime and punishment. There's sort of an anchoring line in the book. In many ways, it was the first line that I wrote. It didn't start the book, but this was my anchoring statement, was this notion of there is no crime to fit this sentence. There is no sentence to fit this crime. And it's about being put to death again and again and again. And I think it's that relationship that I just found fascinating and invigorating and thrilling, actually.
It's funny you said that about the lens that people will approach it to, because I was thinking the same thing. Is that again? I think it's not so much who the author is or the creator of the material; it's the lens that we bring to it. And I was thinking that it really wouldn't matter what religious background you come from. If you had a religious background, is the relevancy, I think, is that we still talk about the death penalty today.
For sure.
And from many different, and just to be candid, I've participated in capital murder cases back in my career. And even when you're close to those, and those things are on the book, I can tell you from a personal examination that you think about it the entire time. Not just the gravity of the situation, but the quote you just gave. And so the relevancy is there. And again, I think the ability for people to bring their own lens to something like that is going to make it wide open to have that discussion on that too. So it's interesting too that you can fold that back historically back to people like that in that question. Where did you go next on your plot line? And because you talked about it's already intriguing, the basement scenes and things like that, but how did you go to develop the characters with the references to the past and everything? What spoke to you to develop your main characters?
So to create these two incarnations of these these damned cursed characters. So I have sort of this modern incarnation of the Judas Iscariot character is a character, Judas Achar, who he is a social worker. He works in a former shell of a church at a homeless soup kitchen. He's a part-time literary sort of volunteer literature professor in a community college. And so it's his awareness of his past sin and betrayal. And yet, from his perspective, this was about strength and sacrifice. And it's about his timeless struggle and tumble with this. Where the criminal element comes in is this modern incarnation of the Pontius Pilate character, who I have him crafted as he works for a global ravenous corporate law firm that has started this practice, which they believe has this sort of Arthurian nobility of criminal defense. But it's really about owning more than earnings and equity. It's about earning souls. There's sort of the metaphor of this sort of darkly present law firm. So he's this Peter Pfeiffer character. That's the incarnation of Pontius Pilate's character, is put in the predicament to defend this sociopath who's been overwhelmed by this dark shadow, who has crucified these three souls in his Chinatown basement. And what was so fascinating is that enabled me to kind of visit, not only through a historical perspective, but very current, the reality of capital punishment. And so, part of his journey into this, his sort of timeless tango with death, was this, this early witnessing of a capital of an electrocution that had taken place in Angola, which is the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And so, again, my perspective is, whether it's wearing a cross that dangles next to our heart or talking about crime and punishment today, I think I don't want to say so rarely, but I feel we're not truly embracing perhaps the violence of the act. And again, without casting judgment of this is for, this is against, but in having these conversations, again, on capital punishment 2,000 years ago or capital punishment today, I think it's revealing the steps, the actions, who is responsible, what happens to both I don't even want to use the word victim, but the soul being punished, if you will, and what happens to those executing justice and the impact of the death penalty that has on them. And so it then creates that dialogue around capital punishment, and then set in this sort of this revelation of a trial where this, again, the irony of what was once Pontius Pilate, who sentenced, frankly, as history says, an innocent, peaceful man to die upon a cross. He's now in a predicament of defending a man who has nailed three people to a cross because of his role with this law firm. And then it's his dawning realization of who he once was. And I've sort of cast his fate different than the Judas character. The Judas is this, he has this sort of lifetime after lifetime, this inevitable sort of suicidal trek, as opposed to the Pilate character, lifetime after lifetime, it's kind of this cruel dawning realization of his past actions. And so it's through this intersection of these very violent crimes in modern day New York, plus some kind of supplementary characters that kind of paint just a more vivid picture of modern day New York, where you're bringing in meth addiction, heroin addiction that has to do with just really difficult sort of trenched lives. And what does that mean? And how we cast judgment on those lives as well.
And those things you just listed, really, most laws don't list them as true legal mitigators, but we know in society we look at it as a mitigator. Would you agree?
For sure.
That we look at that, because I think that in most cases that, and again, it's not amazing, but laws a lot of times really don't allow all the things. You can't go in and claim it's demon possessed, and even if you were demon possessed, but it's not going to happen. But jurors, the people that sit in judgment in these cases, inevitably want to know that, and that's why it does come up in trial, is that it's a mitigator. And it's so prevalent in our society, right? I mean, it's this. I'll tell people all the time, there's very few people or families that that I've ever met that are immune to any of that stuff happening inside their family. You made a good point that I've always thought about too, is that when you look at when we talk about the people involved in for example, in the concept of the crucifixion, is that the person that passes judgment and the person that receives the judgment is an interesting thing I've always thought about is the person that actually does the execution, which is, lack of a better word, a middleman or middle person. These days, it would be whoever flips the switch that activates the plungers on the chemicals
exactly.
or charges the chair with electricity. And back in the day, somebody, a soldier, just nailed people to crosses. Does your book start to entertain any of that paradox? Because that's a whole nother level.
Absolutely. So there's a scene, there's sort of the prologue is set back in ancient times, and it's this initial encounter between Judas and Pilate. But there's also it also sort of captures this moment on a hill of an old Roman centurion called Longinus, who is surrounded by these other younger centurions who they also played this role in erecting the wood and hammering in the nails. And, what was their role to that actual execution, but also how has history cast them? And I was also fascinated with the role, of the church in modern day capital punishment and going down the path of viaticums and kind of these standard practices that I found fascinating that are almost standard. And it's not legal procedure. It's a standard, almost protocol, of this moment of reconciliation with a God. And it's interesting, these moments of reconciliation, the church has very particular rules that when it happens in a hospital or if it happens on a battlefield with an impending death, there's a rotation of 3 specific viaticums. But when it comes to a capital punishment case, it's just the last of these third rites. It's just sort of a passage to the next place. So even I found the church's relationship with capital punishment, which it's a parallel history as well. And it's also a very dark, bloody parallel history, that of the church and capital punishment. And yet most, if not all religions, their moment of conception starts with a violent execution. And so it's to me, discomfort and an uncomfortable conversation around the conversation of spirituality and salvation being really integrated, dependent on, not just death, but, and this is, again, whether it's mythology or, in modern day religions, these are all very violent deaths. And so part of my perspective, again, coming from a faith affirming perspective, was also, to me, that also suggests the level of sacrifice is something so much stronger and more moving than I had ever considered. And so it's a tandem history for sure.
For sure. And again, usually, just to let you know, on the other side of it, if you do bring something into the system and capital punishments on the table, is that a lot of the faiths have processes for assisting in the defense and offering people to come testify during at least a sentencing hearing, right? And I witnessed that and watched that. So I think you have the protocols for the ability to cleanse a soul, but they also have some pretty strong protocols to enact on that. At some point, I've thought about doing, and I'm just going to throw this out right now, and I think the listeners and watchers will be interested, but I've thought lately about crafting a small panel piece on the death penalty, not anybody from the production side offering opinion, but to bring that up and get the opinions of our listeners and watchers. Like you said, thin ice, it's kind of a delicate thing. So if I do that, I'm just going to make an invitation right now, if you don't mind, to maybe consider you coming in and being a part of that.
I would jump at the opportunity.
So I'm just going to throw that out there now, so that I've sort of made halfway a commitment to our audience. So it's probably going to happen now. So unless I take that out in post editing, which I won't, but it's a fascinating thing. So take us into it to the depth that you want to and the places you want to continue with this story.
Yeah. So I should say I'm not an attorney. I happen to be married to one. But a lot of my research was looking at sort of the legal procedure of a capital crime case. And, so there's sort of the obvious parallels of, that you can't help, but all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and you start considering kind of just the notion and the collective body of a jury being 12 souls. And you go back to the apostles of 12 apostles and you start looking at sort of just the relationship of these dozen cast of characters throughout history, not in just these two episodes. And there is something mystical about that jury of 12, whose roots predate even the 12 apostles and disciples. And I just found that kind of an eye-opening, that has to be more than a coincidence. But again, you start looking at sort of the historical precedent, especially when it relates to, and again, a taboo word when we're talking about, true crime or any crime for that matter, is sort of the presence of evil. Right. And you looking at kind of whether it's in 15th century England, whether it's in 7th century Rome, whether it's, 180 in Judea, the protocol around this presence of an external force. Right. And if you even look at the definition of evil today, this cosmic bane force, that releases one from sort of palpable responsibility it's fascinating. And so yet, when it comes to the legality and the reality of, especially in capital punishment cases, it's, again, a line from the book, it's sort of, it's saved for the legends.
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.
Hey everybody, it's Wendy. In case you didn't know, David finally got off his butt and finished his book, True Crime and Consequences. The book is super educational and talks about the world of true crime and where it meets real investigations. It is perfect for everyone, from true crime fans like myself, to the true crime podcaster or YouTuber, to the amateur detective or web sleuth. And not to leave anyone out, you cops need to read this book too. True Crime and Consequences is available at murderpolicepodcast.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, well, pretty much anywhere you'd find a great book like this. So true crime fans, go get your copy today.